individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody. Welcome to Yaron Brook Show. I hope you're having a fantastic 4th of July weekend. This is still a time to celebrate America and to celebrate everything America represents. And I'm sure that's going to come up repeatedly in my conversation with Dr. Andrew Bernstein, who's joining me again. It's been a few weeks since I had you on last time. We were talking about heroes. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, that was great. That was late April, I think. So, but they said time flies when you're having fun, right?
Well, either that or when you're in lockdown and there's nothing else to do, I guess.
Yeah, and you have to watch bad guys burning down American cities.
Yeah. Talk about depressing. So we're going to talk about a lot of topics, many of them depressing today, unfortunately. So we've been asked to do a show where we raise some controversial issues, some issues where we potentially disagree. We'll see the extent to which we disagree or don't disagree. But we're going to cover a number of issues. I'm just going to let you guys know so you know what's coming. We're going to go for about 2 hours. We're going to start with talking about with the discussion of racism, and then we'll talk about kind of the riots, demonstrations. We'll talk about monuments and the destruction of monuments. Then we'll go to immigration. We'll talk about left versus right. And the choice that we face today, and even to the point of talking about Trump versus Biden, and finally, I think we'll try to end on something positive. That is, what's the way out of this? Because it's a mess. It's a mess out there. So first, thanks, Andy, for agreeing to do this. I think.
Oh yeah. Oh, thanks for having me on, Yaron. It's always a pleasure.
Sure. And for all of you guys who want to ask questions, I think this is the way I'd like to do it, is keep your questions focused on the topic, right? So we're going to start with racism. And as I described kind of the sequence of topics, towards the end, you can ask anything, but I'm going to try to keep us on some kind of track. So I'd appreciate if your questions kind of were consistent with that. So start, so ask the questions based on what we're talking about. And then we'll see. I'm open to questions about anything, but let's try to keep this going. So obviously a big issue out there today, the 4th of July, but leading up to this with the demonstrations, the riots, the horrible murder of George Floyd, and all the kind of subsequent events. The big issue that has been out there in the public, other than COVID, which thankfully we're not going to talk about, is the issue of racism. And you put out an essay on, and I recommend everybody go to Andy's website, andrewbernstein.net. There's an essay which is titled "America, a Racist Nation?" ? And so first, why write the essay? What were you trying to achieve with the essay?
Well, I think that obviously racism is a major issue today. The political left has been pushing this idea for a long time, that America's a racist nation, white privilege, white racism, white supremacy is the major problem for non-white Americans. The New York Times, in its endless misinformation campaign, in its 1619 project, claims America was founded to support slavery. So we need clarity on the issue of racism, and is the United States a racist nation? And I think objectivists, as the ones who preeminently support individual rights, are the ones best qualified to write on this topic.
Yeah, I agree. And so let's start maybe with the definition, because there's a lot of confusion out there. Unfortunately, a lot of confusion even among the people who listen to my show about what racism is. So you define racism in the essay. What is the essential characteristic of racism?
Well, it's basically it's a cognitive error. It's a thinking error. It's pushing aside the truth that human beings are individuals first, foremost, and always. They're individuals who make moral choices and are to be judged on that and that alone. And racism is the idea that your character is hardwired, is predetermined by what biological group you're born into. Your character and your intellect, the most important things about you are determined by what tribe, what race, or what gender you're born into. Is determined by your biology. And in fact, in reality, biology and moral character have zero correlation to one another.
Yep. Yes. I mean, racism is, it's basically built on two premises with which we as objectivists reject, thoroughly, which is determinism. You're determined by your genes somehow. You're determined by your tribe's gene. It's not even your individual genes. You're determined by your ancestors' genes somehow. And secondly, that you should be judged and estimated by which tribe you belong to, and the most primitive form of tribe. It's not even a tribe that's a nation or something like that. It's the most basic, I might call it the most primitive form of collectivism, right? Because it goes back to the color of your skin and the tribe that you belong to hundreds of years ago, as if it matters to any of us. It's
right. That's right. No, the two fundamental tenets of racism: collectivism, that the group, in this case the race, is preeminent over the individual, and determinism. Yep. There's no free will. Your character is hardwired into you by virtue of whatever tribe you're born into. It's primitive. It's a caveman's view of human life.
Yep. And so what is your view? So obviously, and you bring this out in the essay, I mean, there's a history of racism in this country. There's a deep and long history of racism in this country. Obviously slavery, but even after we fought a brutal, civil war, 600,000, young men died and the slaves were free. Even then, racism was still a part of American life and American culture, and in pretty brutal form.
Yeah, absolutely. The Jim Crow era in particular. I mean, Booker T. Washington's staff at Tuskegee Institute kept a log of the recorded lynchings of blacks in America who couldn't possibly have known if they were guilty of any crime or not, because these lynch mobs didn't let them go to trial.
Sure.
But so I think it was like 3,400 or 3,500 known lynchings, and that doesn't even include the unknown ones. And then there were the white race riots, Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921, in Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898, burning down black neighborhoods, killing innocent blacks. Very often, this was driven, in addition to racism, Yaron, is driven by envy, because you had educated, successful blacks, and these white thugs didn't like it. They killed these educated people, burned down the neighborhoods. I mean, it was just absolutely brutal and murderous. And it's disgraceful if it happens in Germany, Russia, or China, but it should never happen in the United States, a country that was founded on individual rights. It's an absolute disgrace to our nation.
And it really is stunning, the extent to which, it really survived into the 50s and 60s. And in spite of the fact that this country's built on the most anti-racist principles, ever, right? I mean, it's built on the idea of individualism, and yet it's somehow survived for almost 200 years as part of the fabric of this country.
Yeah, it was mostly in the South, but not entirely. There were white race riots in the North, and a lot of violence against innocent blacks. Fortunately, the good news, of course, is this started to change in the 1960s, with the success of the civil rights movement, and a lot of courageous people who risked their lives and lost their lives. People like Medgar Evers, Martin Luther King, who were killed, both of them, Rosa Parks, real heroes. And I think, I like to quote, I'm fond of quoting Confucius, who said, the beginning of wisdom is to see to it that things are called by their right names. Mm-hmm. Well, the right name for the civil rights movement is the individual rights movement for Black Americans, and long overdue.
Yes.
And since the 1960s, I think the evidence is very strong that we've seen a sharp diminishment of white racism in this country. I mean, it's still around, but the trend line on that is in the right direction. It's greatly diminished and moving in that direction. I think there's a lot of evidence to support that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you, but up until recently, I mean, I have to say that, and this is anecdotal, just your essay is full of anecdotes, and I have anecdotes. My anecdotes go in the reverse direction. So I certainly would have thought that up until 4 or 5 years ago, that racism is in significant decline in the United States. But there's just, I see it on this show, the YouTube, the chat on my YouTube channel. The number of racists who show up to listen to me
Is that right? Really? Wow.
Unbelievable. It's just unbelievable. And it started, the first time I observed it was during the campaign, in 2016. And I did a show on the alt-right. You remember the alt-right? There was,
oh yeah, Richard Spencer, Jared Taylor, those guys.
Yeah, and Milo was like on the border of it, and there was all this stuff going on. And I did a show on it. And the stuff, the response I got in places like Twitter and other places, I mean, anti-Semitic stuff that I couldn't imagine I would ever see in my life. Certainly not in America. I thought maybe in Europe still, but in America, I would never see the swastikas and me on being sent back to Israel, which was nice because other people want to send me somewhere else. It was just shocking. And ever since then, it's been around and it keeps bubbling to the surface. And sure, it could be a small minority of people who just happen to be harassing me. And, Ben Shapiro got the same treatment. And it has gotten the same treatment over the last 4 or so years. It could be just a small group, but I certainly think there's been an increase, and I have no empirical data to say whether it's large or small, but it's certainly been an increase. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the alt-right is a scary phenomenon, and again, I see to it that things are called by their right names. If right means individualism and capitalism, and left means collectivism and socialism, then these guys are neo-Nazis. They're National Socialists. They want a white, Richard Spencer, Jared Taylor, guys like that. I think of them as the National Socialist left. In compare and contrast to the Marxist left. And they're leftists, they're socialists. They want a white ethno-state. There's no individual rights. If you're an honest, non-white person, you want to live in the white man's land, you forget it. If you're a honest white person, you marry an honest, non-white, want to live in the white man's land, you can't. There's no individual rights here. They're collectivists to the bone. And I think they are still a small minority. Unfortunately, they're harassing you. But unfortunately, I think they're going to grow. The Marxist left is so pushing an anti-white agenda that it gives Richard Spencer and these guys, the intellectual leaders of the Nazi left, it gives them ammunition to go to say to the more ignorant members of the white community, we're being persecuted, et cetera, et cetera. And there's only safety in the tribe. There's only safety in the collective. And I think the National Socialist left is going to grow scarily based on the dominance in the intellectual culture of the anti-white Marxist left.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think the growth of the last few years that I've seen, at least in these neo-Nazi types, is fueled by identity politics of the left. And it's like, yeah, you want us to identify by our ethnic? Okay, well, exactly. White, we're coming for you.
White lives matter. These guys say
to me, it's very, very scary. And so I just want to set some terms because I don't want us to speak over each other. I don't categorize right and left in the way you do. I used to, but I don't anymore. So this idea that right is individual rights and capitalism and left is collectivism, I've given up on that. I think it's a lost cause. To me, right is what you defined as a collectivistic, a neo-Nazi type collectivism, and the left is the socialist type of collectivism. They're both the same thing, and they're both crap. We're individualists. All of the rest of them are collectivists, and we're not on the right or left spectrum anymore because there are too many battles. There are too many conceptual battles, right? We have to fight for too many words, and the way people use right today is not like that. It's just, I've given up on trying to re-educate them on what right is. And if you look at the history of the term, it never really meant exactly what we would like it to mean or what I meant. Your position is Rand's position, right? And I'm saying, I've declared, I've surrendered the term.
But if that's the case that you're on, then I think we should just drop the spatial metaphors altogether. It's too confusing. And just talk about individualism, capitalism versus collectivism, socialism, and their many different iterations.
I agree with that. And because the problem with defining a right-left spectrum is, where do we fit? And if you accept my definition, you don't fit anywhere. We're not centrist, right? We're certainly not centrist.
Right.
So we don't belong. So I think the spectrum has to be at the end: individualism, collectivism. And there are many branches of collectivism. There tends to be only one branch of individualism.
Right.
There are many branches of collectivism, but they're all over there. And because the right, or the people who identify themselves as right, have become more and more collectivists. Right, the people who identify as right, and even the Republican Party has become more and more collectivist. And we could say they're all leftists now, but then people don't know what we're talking about. So I agree. Let's just drop the spectrum and just call them what they really are, which is the collectivists of various
and socialists of different types.
Yeah. I mean, fascism is a form of socialism, ultimately.
Yeah, without a doubt.
All forms of statism and
right.
And again, people are super confused about this. And as objectivists, our job is to try to bring them clarity.
Yeah. One little thing I do in that is I very rarely use the term Nazi anymore. I just use National Socialism, which is the full and proper name. And it helps introduce the idea that these guys are outright socialists. Yep. You know, your life has been socialized. It belongs to the state. Doesn't belong to you just as much as under the communists.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not sure statistically if racism, white versus black racism, is on the rise or not. I don't know. The anecdotes scare me. I'll give you one thing that I encounter again among my listeners more than anybody else. No, actually, it's out there more in the culture. And this is, I don't know if you've encountered this, Andy. It's this IQ stuff. If it comes from the bell curve.
Charles Murray's
bell curve. But I think Charles Murray did it, maybe I'm giving him too much credit, somewhat innocently, but people are it's become a big talking point, right? Blacks have lower IQ than whites. And therefore, black countries are going to always be poorer than whites, whether you bring them individualism, capitalism, doesn't matter. Blacks are inferior because they have low IQ. Of course, we Ashkenazi Jews beat all of them up because we have the highest IQ. So we're like, but usually the way they spin it is, we're too smart for our own good. And what we use our IQ for is to take over the world. Of course, nobody told me and you about the Elders of Zion, where they keep us out of that one. But the whole IQ discussion, which is unbelievably has become racist, and they call it race realism. And they accuse me of being anti-science because I reject the whole thing, right? And I fight this battle constantly.
No, I know, like Jared Taylor, for example, one of the leaders of the, the so-called, and these guys, Richard Spencer, Jared Taylor, these guys are well educated. I think Taylor's got a degree in philosophy from Yale, and Richard Spencer has degrees, I think, from the University of Chicago, studied intellectual history at Duke. They studied with the same postmodern professors that the Marxists left did. And so there's same identity politics, where I identify by our race. There's white truth, there's black truth, there's male truth, there's female truth. And then you get into the whole collectivist discussion that you're talking about. Asians tend to have the highest IQs. And so these white ethno-state advocates want to keep Asians out of the country. They want to keep, if that were the case, we'd want more Asians in the country, right? We want the brains. We want to benefit from the brains. But, they're a threat to the white man's supremacy. The blacks have lower IQ. Jared Taylor said, when blacks are in control, Western civilization disappears. All civilization disappears. He said, it's a terrifying notion. And it's classic racism. Moral character and intellectual abilities are grounded 100% in biology. And how do you explain, Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver and Madam C.J. Walker and Dr. Ben Carson, and how do you explain
the most educated? You know what the most educated immigrant group in the United States is right now?
Probably Asians, I would guess.
Nigerians.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I heard. Yeah, okay, right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's just it's glorified bullshit. These people are spewing, and it horrifies me. And so somebody asked, does Andrew think that race realism has any validity? I mean, this is a real issue for people out there. And somebody
But,
put dollars to ask this question.
So it's all these black geniuses that can't be explained by the theory. And then there's these white thugs, these white guys, and then Asians generally score very high on IQ tests, but they're Asian thugs also. How do you explain these Klan guys who, stereotypically, and I think in many cases in reality, were semi-illiterate, low IQ guys, but they claim to be, they claim white supremacy based on, there's no way to explain millions of cases of outliers and anomalies on this theory. It's just, it's anybody who's looking at reality, it's clearly false.
Yep. Let's see, we got a few questions. What does it take to, and this is a good, well, let me see, maybe that'll be the final question. Is it true that if a racist lived in a single race country, they would still find someone to hate?
That's a good question, isn't it? I mean, it reminds me that the old Star Trek episode, the original Star Trek, where they, the Kirk and Captain Kirk and those guys land on some planet, and everybody had on the planet, half their face was white and half their face was black. But half of them, the right side of the face was white, and the other ones, the white side of the right side of the face was black, and they hated each other. And they hated each other, over this. And I think, unfortunately, mankind's free will is simply, it's hardwired into us, right? And people will make their choices, and they'll choose to hate somebody based on religion or based on race, or in Rwanda, the Tutsis and the Hutus were black, but they're based on different tribes. It's endless. It's absolutely this kind of bigotry and racism. It's endless, and the only cure for it, the only panacea, is colorblind individualism. That really none of this matters. What matters is moral character, moral choices people make.
Well, it turns out that reason is an achievement, and using your mind and thinking, and which is a requirement for being an individualist, is an achievement. And that for too much of human history, people didn't make the right choices and didn't achieve reason and individualism. And this is a consequence of a kind of a perceptual level mentality. I talked about it in The Missing Link, right? This is the non-conceptual mentality, which is what these racists are.
Yeah, these guys are cavemen. And to go back to your point, it's a scary point, but I think it's true. And that is, white racism has been diminishing since the 1960s in this country, but may well be on the rise again, fueled by the identity politics and anti-white rhetoric of the Marxist left. They feed off of each other. They always did. Leonard Peikoff got it brilliantly in The Ominous Parallels. We're turning it into Weimar America. And it was Charlottesville, Virginia, 2 years ago. The Nazi types, the National Socialist types, the Klan and the American Nazi Party versus the Marxist thugs, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and they're fighting it out. Violence in the street. It's just like Weimar Germany. And The Ominous Parallels, which was published in 1983, are more ominous today than ever.
Absolutely. So. Is a good lead in, and then we'll go to the kind of talk about the left, we said we weren't going to use left and right. We're going to talk about the kind of Black Lives Matter type people. What does it take to cure someone of racism? I've heard of a former skinhead who left his organization to become a relatively normal person. I like the relatively normal, but yeah.
Well, what did Woody Allen once say to Diane Keaton? Nothing wrong with you that a little Prozac and a polo mallet, couldn't cure. I mean, that might be good for a racist. But seriously, there's only one cure for it's a form of collectivism, and there's only one panacea for any form of collectivism, and that's individualism. But like Ayn Rand taught us, we have to exercise our rational faculty and think. It's much easier to classify people based on perceptual level skin color things than it is to try and judge their moral character and classify, and judge them exclusively on that alone.
So somebody's asked, the 1619 Indoctrination Project is being taught in schools. Do we know of any rebuttals that are being planned to the lies of the narrative? My guess is that there are a lot of non-objectivists, like conservative and others, who are going to engage in rebuttals and have already engaged in rebuttals for this. The challenge is, and the problem is, that the left, the conventional left, controls the schools. They just control the educational establishment. And even if you had a rebuttal, even if you had an objectivist rebuttal, it's not going to go anywhere in terms of the getting into the educational establishment as long as they control the levers of power, which they do, unequivocally they do.
Yeah, the Marxist left controls the entire intellectual culture, the humanities programs in the universities, the public school system, many of the private schools, Hollywood, the media, the New York Times, the Democratic Party. They're immensely powerful. And by the way, one piece of good news, but again, we have to talk about your point. Mary Graybar's book on Howard Zinn, was it Refuting Howard Zinn, or I forget the title of it. It's good. It's good. Howard Zinn, of course, a darling of the Marxist left, and to the extent they teach American history at all anymore, they often use his book. So you get these rebuttals, and they're often good. But like you said, very often the school system was just so leftist, don't want they clamor for diversity, but it's only racial and gender diversity they're interested in too often. Intellectual diversity, with some exceptions, they're not interested in.
Yep. So what did you make of what do you make of Black Lives Matter, of kind of the response to the murder in Minneapolis? And Black Lives Matter has been around, I think, since 2014. Kind of how it's evolved and become this mass movement.
Yeah, I mean, the murder of George Floyd was horrific. Was it Derek Chauvin, clearly guilty of police brutality, maybe a racist, because the cops do this to white guys sometimes also, like that Tony Timpa case in Dallas a few years ago. So it may be racist, definitely police brutality. It's horrible, but Talib Stark's book, Black Lives Matter, Lies, Black Lives Matter, I think should be read by everybody. He points out, and a number of Black conservatives point out, Candace Owens, Sheriff David Clark, and people like that point out, 90% at least of black murder victims are killed by Black thugs, gangbangers. Talib Starks calls them the urban terrorists. They're the real danger to Black lives. And if Black Lives Matter actually cared about Black lives, which I don't think they do, they would be leading this discussion. What policy recommendations, what philosophic changes, what can we do to lower the insanely high homicide rate in many of the Black urban neighborhoods? But they don't talk about that. 10% or fewer of Black murder victims every year are murdered by the rest of the population: whites, Asians, Latinos, biracial individuals. That doesn't matter. Again, see to it that things are called by their right names. For Black Lives Matter, the proper name is Black Lives Matter if you're killed by a white guy, even if it's in self-defense. Then we'll protest and even riot. But the horrific crimes by the gangbangers and urban terrorists in the neighbor and many of Black urban neighborhoods, blank out, as John Galt would say. We just evade it. We're not interested. They're a Marxist, racist, organization. They're the Black version of Antifa.
Well, in a sense, it's worse than that, because I've heard at least one of the founders of Black Lives Matter basically say that the Black on Black violence is a response to what they call institutionalized racism, right? It's a response to the fact that white people are white, I guess, because we're racist by definition under this idea of institutionalized racism by just having white skin. They actually say that if you abolish the police, and they're serious about abolishing the police, they're not kidding. They're talking about really getting rid of the police, that violence will go away, because the violence among Blacks is a response to these institutions, right? To these oppressive institutions in their existence.
Again, Marxism is a Marxist philosophy. Marxism is a secular delusion akin to religion. You don't look at reality. You have your arbitrary assumptions you start with. America's a racist nation, and then you churn out your deductions. If you looked at reality, you would notice, wait a minute, there've been millions and millions of Black Americans who've risen, out of poverty into the middle class in the last 60 years or so. That wouldn't have been possible under. We've seen institutionalized racism. Jim Crow laws are institutionalized racism. We don't have that in the country anymore. There's tens of millions of educated, affluent Black Americans. Yet tens of millions of white voters support Obama, even in 2012, after a decidedly mediocre at best first term in office. You see the Pew Research results when they asked about interracial marriage, as like 91% of white Americans thought that interracial marriage was either good or indifferent. Only 9% oppose it, as opposed to 18% of Black Americans who oppose it. You know, all of this data showing that white racism is dying. It may be coming back. Your point is well taken, but it's because of these guys on the left who are so anti-white. So I mean, look, Marxists don't look at reality any more than hardcore religionists do. They have their arbitrary premises and then they churn out their deductions. So yeah, it's an insane mentality. It just overlooks reality. You know, that this has so many. You can't explain if it's systemic institutionalized white racism in this country. You couldn't explain the millions of educated, affluent, middle-class Black Americans. It wouldn't be possible.
No, and as you said, I mean, there used to be institutionalized racism.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
even in the North, there were laws all over this country that truly redlined cities and forced Blacks into particular neighborhoods and didn't allow them. And it was city councils and state legislatures and federal HUD entities that Roosevelt created, and these entities clearly had racist intentions, but all of that was taken apart, and not that it all just disappeared instantly, but has been fading in its influence since the 1960s. And yet they act as if we still live in the 1930s and 40s. And that all this is still part of the legal system around us. And again, not to diminish the fact that I think there are racists, and there certainly seem to be racists within the police force, although the empirics there are tricky to dissect. So I've seen empirical evidence on both sides of that, the extent to which there's racism on police forces. But instead of celebrating the fact that it's getting better and emphasizing what would get it better, which is emphasizing individualism and going after, because there are things that we can do to police forces to make them better. I think we both agree that the number one thing you could do to the police to make it better and have less abuse and less corruption and less everything is do away with the war on drugs. It's probably the number one thing that corrupts the police and corrupts law enforcement in this country.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And I call, this idea of defund the police or abolish the police. I mean, it's lunacy. I mean, and of course, the worst victims of it will be the honest Black men, women, and children in the high crime areas. They're the victims right now, and it's just going to get worse. I saw, and I really respect a lot of the Black conservatives, their independence, even though many of them are very religious, and we have disagree about that, but they'll look at reality on these issues anyway. And I saw Talib Starks, and I think everybody should read his book, Black Lives Matter. Talib Starks, on PragerU, we talked about the 5 major problems confronting Black America. And he pointed out the urban terrorists and the high crime rate, the progressive or leftist politics, the victim mentality point. And he said racism doesn't make the top 5 in his list. And I think he's right. White racism still exists even before the rise of the so-called alt-right. It's still around, hasn't died. It's poison. It's irrational. We need to continue to be vigilant and fight it. But it has faded to the point where it's not even, I think Talib Starks is right, it's not amongst the top 5 dangers that confront Black Americans today. We need to, here's why Ayn Rand is so valuable, epistemologically. Look at reality. What a concept, right?
Yeah, and one of the great tragedies about all of this is that the Black communities have been betrayed by their own leadership. That is, it's not like Marxism is ingrained in being Black, right? We're not, that would be racist, right? It's that their leaders, their cultural leaders and their political leaders and their intellectual leaders, since the end of the civil rights, since even during the civil rights, unfortunately, many of them were very much on the kind of the progressive side of the political spectrum, the collectivist side. But certainly since then, they have just been horrific and have entrenched this victim mentality and entrenched a culture of victimhood rather than a culture of, success and rising up and a culture of individualism. Now, what the Black communities really need is more individualistic leadership and more intellectuals who promote individualism within their sphere.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, Larry Elder did a good movie recently, Uncle Tom, about the history of the Black conservative movement, and it seems to be on the rise somewhat in the Black community. And it's a mixed bag. I mean, again, conservatives tend to be very religious,
Yes.
so they have their own delusional world. Well, I don't think that's quite as venomous as Marxism, and they have some support for individualism and the soul, which is a backhand way of referencing the mind, and it's good to see, because they celebrate America, individualism, capitalism, the self-made man, entrepreneurship, against the Marxist leadership of people like Al Sharpton and just lives like that.
No, absolutely. I think the Black conservatives, the number of them that are quite good, and I'm not convinced about the more broader conservative movement, but we'll get to that. We're going to do a segment on the left versus the right. So the traditional left versus right, because the conservatives today scare the bejesus out of me. But they're kind of the conservatives that have risen to intellectual prominence over the last few years. And I think it's all connected to a certain Trump phenomena that I find really scary, and which primarily motivates my never Trumpism. But let's see. We got a series of questions. Let's see. How do I convince my siblings who are bought into the scary mix of BLM, racist America, and race realism? Yeah, that's quite a mixture. How would we convince other people?
Well, I think part of the obvious answer here is we need to read, digest, and understand Atlas Shrugged. Thank God, Ayn Rand wrote the two greatest novels in world literature. So that's a plus. The problem, of course, in many cases today is the public schools are so bad that a lot of the graduates struggle just with the mechanics of reading. And reading Atlas Shrugged is maybe hopeless for them. But again, the only way to convince people that racism of any kind, anti-Black, anti-white, anti-Hutu, anti-Tutsi, anti-Jew, whatever it is, the only way to convince them that in any iteration this is irrational is that individualism is the panacea, that human beings are first, foremost, and always individual. They're not a member of a tribe, and they make moral choices, and this is how we judge them, and the color of their skin is simply irrelevant. And Jen, point out, that biology is so important. Gender separates us biologically much more than race does. I have much more in common with an Asian man or a Black man or a Latino man than I do with a white woman. But leaving romantic love aside, it's much better for me to have trustworthy women as my friends than untrustworthy men, because morally, the most important characteristic of all, our character, biology doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. This is somehow we have to convince people to use their minds and reason on this issue.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I think that the idea of moral character, the idea of a self-made soul, the idea of we determine our own destiny, that is the idea that's being attacked today by both the collectivists of the left and the collectivists of the right. It's on both sides that is under attack. And I think that is what scares me the most, is that the idea of free will philosophically is under attack by intellectuals across the board. And that just opens it up to all kinds of racists, authoritarians of all types. Once you reject free will, then you don't determine your moral characters. It's all out the window.
Yeah, once free will's gone, then we're not making choices anyway. So what's the moral objection of a dictator? Tell us what to do. We don't make choices in the first place.
Yep, absolutely. And in that sense, all of these issues that we talk about, these political issues, these everything we talk about is at its core philosophical. At the core is false philosophical ideas that are driving people towards this tribalism and towards whether it's a rejection of reason, whether it's a rejection of free will, whether it's a rejection of individualism. They all come from philosophical foundation. That's why the battle is philosophy.
Without a doubt. Ayn Rand made that very clear.
Absolutely. Let's see. To what extent is Black culture the cause of poverty and crime issues in that community? Is the culture downstream of policy? Is it education?
Well, that reverses the causation. I mean, that's a neo-Marxist kind of argument that, that culture comes from poverty. If that were the case, then again, like I said before,
how do you rise up from?
You couldn't explain the rise of tens of millions of Black Americans into education and the middle class. One catastrophe is the public school system, which is terrible. It was terrible when I was a kid. Now it's an atrocity. Maybe worse in the Black urban neighborhoods, and so these kids aren't learning to read. I think one thing we need to do, one policy recommendation I would make right from the start, is use phonics and only phonics to teach reading. Reject every form of the failed whole word method, look, say, whole language, all of them. Teach kids to read in kindergarten at age 5. Don't wait till age 6 in first grade. Use phonics. Have them read great stories like Peter Pan, or stories of Black heroes who overcome terrible obstacles to reach great achievements. Show phonics works. Show the kids that there's a lot of fun stuff in books, a lot of hero stories that they could read, motivate them to want to read. And then I think, to me, the single greatest problem confronting Black America today is the rejection of the mind by so many young men in the hood. And if you teach these kids to read at age 5 and they're motivated to read these great hero stories, I think you're going to see more and more of these highly intelligent guys embrace the mind in education and reject the idea, the vicious idea, racist idea that education's for whites and Asians, and it's not for the Black man. Black man's to be gangster. I mean, that is just horrendous. And I think if we do that in the schools, which is hard to do because it's controlled by the Marxist left, and they don't want the kids to read, which is why they rejected phonics in the first place. But if we could do that, that would help. Education is the key to this, and of course to have education, you need a culture that embraces it. I mean, Thomas Sowell pointed out that Caribbean immigrants, second generation Caribbean immigrants, have higher affluence levels than the white Americans. And I think that part of the reason for that is the Caribbean immigrants emphasize education, and their kids do much better in school than a lot of the native-born Black kids in the hood.
Same with the African immigrants, the immigrants that are coming from Africa, like the Nigerians we mentioned. Right. They have more BAs and MAs and PhDs than any other group does.
That's great. That's really good.
I mean, Marva Collins is a great example of what she did in Chicago, in the heart of one of the most horrible neighborhoods in the country, where the government schools have just been unbelievable failures. They're more like prisons than they are schools, right? They're places where you send your kids to keep them, inside 4 walls for half the day. They don't teach anything in these schools. They spend $15,000 per kid a year. The Catholic schools, Marva Collins spent, a fraction of that. And the success of her kids is just unbelievable. They all went to college. They all graduated. You're right. That's a good example, Yaron. She drilled phonics from the earliest age. Had the kids read these great stories about heroes and stuff. And she was having like 10, 11, 12-year-old kids read The Fountainhead, and they understood a lot of it too. I mean, they were that advanced. And she expected a lot from them. She pushed them. She had high expectations, and kids rise to what you expect of them. If you don't expect them to achieve anything, they won't, which is what the public education or the government education does today. Yeah, and Marva Collins used a lot of tough love. You're right. She had very high expectations. She pushed the kids, and she did it with a lot of love. She made it clear to them. She cared about them. She cared about their education. She cared about their future lives, and the kids responded. And West Side Prep was a tremendous success, and unfortunately went out of business eventually after, 30 or 40 years of great success, because when you're a private school trying to compete with the government monolith, it's very different. Very difficult to get the funds. And here's where Ayn Rand's idea of tax credits for sending your kids to private schools is outstanding. Absolutely. And if you guys haven't heard of Marva Collins, you should look her up. I mean, she's a real hero, a real hero.
Yeah, Marva Collins' Way. That's a book you can get from Amazon on Marva Collins' educational triumphs.
What do you think about decriminalization as opposed to legalization of drugs? It makes it much tougher to solve drug crimes, murders, while actually increasing the incentive to get into the drug trade. Increasing, I don't understand that.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah. I mean, why not legalize? Why decriminalization is like a cop-out? It's either legal or it's not, right? And the state has no business telling you what you can consume and what you can't.
Yeah. There's a lot of good reasons to legalize drugs. One is that in a free country, adults have the moral right to ingest whatever substances they want. And two, if we end the legal war on drugs, we can ramp up a philosophic war on drugs. Reasoning with people, not forcing them, but appealing to their minds. Hey, you want to have a great life? Clean living will help you much more than cocaine will in education, career, romantic love, friendship, travel. And of course, I think the numbers show very clearly the homicide rate that swirls around the drug trafficking is just horrendous. And
if you do it worldwide, it's tens of thousands of people. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah, and legalizing drugs will bring the homicide rate down dramatically. One economist estimated 25 to 75% if we legalize drugs. And I think this is one thing certainly that's very important to bring down the off the charts homicide rates in the Black urban neighborhoods. Defund the criminals, not defund the police. I
like that. Defund the criminals. And the drug, the fact that drugs are illegal is the way they get funded.
Exactly.
It's the way, by the way, terrorists get funded in Afghanistan and other places, the way the Marxists were funded in Colombia. The Marxist terrorists who were trying to establish a Marxist revolution, they were funded through the drug trade. I mean, it is funding every violent, horrific organization out there in the world is funded by drug money. And the only reason they make a lot of money off of drugs is because it's illegal. Imagine if there was competition, and if it was legal in the streets, you could buy it, prices would come down, profit margins would come down. And
no, that's right. And remember, alcohol is a drug, and alcohol was illegal at one time in this country too. What did it do? Well, it made criminals like Al Capone and those guys very wealthy. And when it was finally decriminalized, it disenfranchised thugs like that, and the homicide rate did come down.
And I think the other element to that is that there's nothing more corrupting of the police than spending almost all of your time on victimless crimes, right? The trade and the consumption of drugs is victimless. I mean, you're the victim, but it's victimless in terms of individual rights. And yet this is what consumes so much of the police energy and time and effort. And then it opens you up to corruption when these gangsters have suitcases full of cash that they can lug around and hand out. This is where the police corruption comes into, and you get unsavory characters entering the police because there's a bonanza there if you get into the drug side of things.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to alcohol again. Al Capone had judges, cops, police chiefs, mayors on his payroll. I mean, it's not funny, but I mean, the money he made, yeah, he bought off the whole legal system.
The Mexican cartel has the entire Mexican government in their pocket, and then it has judges and police chiefs and border patrol people in their pocket all over the United States. I mean, it's that kind of money is going to buy you influence, and the only way to stop it is, I mean, we're not going to go to all out real war about this, and you can't actually have a war against an inanimate object. So the war on drugs is just stupid right on its face. But the only way to deal with this is to legalize the whole thing.
And that would certainly lower the homicide rate. We're talking about, this is the kind of policy that Black Lives Matter, if they cared about Black lives, should be advocating. Defund the criminals, legalize drugs, use phonics in kindergarten to teach reading. Recognize that the urban terrorists are the main danger to Black lives, not white racism, which has been dying for a long time prior to its rise, as you pointed out, as a reaction to the left's anti-white rhetoric. If Black Lives Matter cared about Black lives, these are the kinds of policies they would be advocating, but they don't. They're just another Marxist, terrorist organization like Antifa. It's like Marxist terrorism in white and Marxist terrorism in black, but it's Marxist terrorism either way. And they'll end up slugging it out. My worst nightmare, with the Ku Klux Klan and the Nazi Party, like in Charlottesville a few years ago, except on a larger scale. And Leonard Peikoff's, prescient book in 1983, The Ominous Parallels, is becoming true.
Well, and it seems to always be the case that these Marxists they become fascist when it's convenient. That is, they sway to the more dominant totalitarian when that's what's so many of the communists in Weimar Germany were Nazis a month later, right?
Well, they switch back and forth.
It's easy to flip.
It's two different versions of totalitarianism, and it's much more difficult. Much more difficult to switch from a Marxist or Nazi to an individual rights supporter, but to go from race war socialism to class war socialism, or vice versa, is much easier.
Somebody's arguing that Charlottesville is a lie. No, Charlottesville was real. There was a bunch of white supremacist neo-Nazi thugs who marched in the street shouting, anti-Semitic and racist slogans. There were no nice guys there. This was a really.
Yeah, I wish it was a lie. I'd breathe easy if it was like, and these riots now. I wish they were a lie, but unfortunately they're not.
All of this is a reality, and Jews will now replace us with something that was chanted, not some conspiracy theory. You can hear it loud and clear on the video, sadly, but it exists, and it's disgusting. So
it's fascinating, isn't it? Anti-Semitism never dies. It's got to be fueled.
Left and right. Right, and the left and right adopted. I mean, they're all anti-Semitic. It's we're the one, the Jews are the one group that everybody loves to hate. It's
extraordinary. I remember my first time in London a few years ago with Rosie Ginsburg to lecture there, and so I said, let's go to Hyde Park, and he said he didn't know me. There's Dr. Bernstein. He said, there is a lot of diversity in Hyde Park. He said you'll get anti-Semitism from a Nazi standpoint, you'll get anti-Semitism from a Marxist standpoint, and you'll get anti-Semitism from a jihadist standpoint. So there's a lot of diversity there.
A lot of diversity.
Oh, yeah. It's not funny, but
no,
I mean,
it's not. It's true.
Never dies. That version of racism never dies.
No. I mean, its death is going to require what we talked about before. Its death is going to require real individualism. That's the only way. And people try to skirt around that and try to avoid it by creating different types of groups. But at the end of the day, collectivism has to be abolished if you want to abolish all forms of racism.
Exactly.
So what is your view of these monuments, the monuments to Lee and to Jefferson Davis and to kind of the Confederacy and the Confederate flag? What's your view of that whole kind of Southern history commemorated in these monuments?
Well, the Confederacy was a slave society and no place in the United States. So I think if some individuals want to wave the Confederate flag or put up statues of Jefferson Davis and so on their private property, that's their right. Just like they can wave the sickle and hammer or the swastika, or have pictures of Chairman Mao. I would try to reason with them not to, but that's their right. But I think in public places, the American flag should fly, not the Confederate flag. I don't think there should be statues of people who defended the slave society. I don't think they should be torn down by rioters. I think they'd be sold off to private individuals and then put them in their garage or in a privately owned museum on their privately owned museum, private land. It's their right. Like I said, I'll try to reason with them not to, but it's their right. It's their right to do so. But public property in this country should fly the American flag, not the Confederate flag. And you want war heroes? The South has no shortage of war heroes, starting with the Revolutionary War and going through any number of wars. The South has a strong military tradition. Put up the guys who defended freedom, not the guys who defended slavery, for God's sake. This isn't rocket surgery, as they say.
Absolutely. I mean, I find it disgusting that people would defend statues that celebrate a general who explicitly had the option of fighting for the North and explicitly chose to fight for a slave society in the South, right? And is considered a hero by so many. And yes, people say you can't tear their statues down because they're history. statues in public places are celebrations. They're there to honor somebody. We don't honor the people who defended slavery. You don't honor people who defended, in evil institutions like slavery. And Jefferson Davis, who was the president of a slave society that tried to secede from the United States, or in other words, committed treason. These are treasonous people. There's no world in which they should occupy, statues in public places. Again, if it's private property, you can do with your private property what you can. And as Andy said, we will argue vehemently that you should change your mind. But it's your property.
Yeah, and in public places, like I said, the South has no shortage of great military heroes. Start with George Washington. We could point out he was a slave owner, condemn that, but that's not why we're honoring him. We're honoring him because he won the War of Independence, because he was the first president of the United States. We're honoring him for his achievements in support of freedom, and we condemn him for being a slave owner.
Absolutely.
But the South has any number of war heroes who defended the United States. They put up their statues with the American flag.
Yep. And it's, I think I did a show on this. I mean, I'm a little wary of having the government decide who are heroes and putting up their statues. That's one of the beauties of kind of a real capitalist society where all property is privately owned and people have put up the statues that they want to, right now, I'm sure that there are lots of people in Washington who'd like to put up statues of Obama all over the place, of their, statues should not be politicized. Ideas should not be, the state shouldn't back up its versions of you. I think Trump's proposal now to have this garden of American statues of American heroes, right? And he's got a list of who he thinks should be in. And, I probably like half the list and hate half the list. And of course, the next president will have his list and I'll hate, at least half, if not more. And it becomes a political issue in terms of which statues are going to be. Just get the government out of building statues and building monuments. Leave it to private individuals to decide who are the heroes and who deserves to be a hero. But yes, we agree on the monuments, and we agree that the thugs, the mobs, the rioters shouldn't be the ones deciding. They just took down a statue of Christopher Columbus in Baltimore and threw it into the river.
It's not funny. No, it's just hideous.
It happened today.
Again, we could condemn Columbus for his flaws, but that's not why we celebrate him. We celebrate him in effect for bringing Western civilization to the North American continent. Yep. And making life potentially better for everybody, including, I don't like the term Native Americans. It's politically correct. It makes it sound like these tribes were indigenous to the North American continent, and they weren't. American Indians is inaccurate. They're not from India. They're from, Central Asia. But potentially life better for these tribes, for blacks once you ended slavery, for white immigrants. Bring Western civilization. We celebrate Columbus, properly for that. And even if he was a bad guy, mobs should be restrained. We need much more police intervention to put these riots down.
Absolutely. All right, let's turn to the non-contentious, typically issue. Although I have a feeling we're not going to disagree too much about this issue of immigration. Which people hate me for. I am despised all over Facebook and all over the web as being an advocate for immigration, something that I've always thought as being bread and butter American, as being fundamental to the nature of America. But so I don't know exactly what your view of immigration is, but I'll just lay out my view is, ideally, I'm a proponent of open immigration. What does that mean? That means that anybody can come into this country as long as they don't pose a risk to the people who are already here. And that risk constitutes carrying an infectious disease, which is relevant these days, right? So I think it could be completely legitimate for somebody to point a thermometer at your forehead as you cross the border. Make sure you're not coming in with a fever, right? I don't think that's a violation of rights. Checking, criminal background checks, so you're not a criminal coming in, and clearly that you're not some jihadi terrorist, right? So you're not an agent of a foreign power come to destroy the United States. But as long as you don't constitute a risk to the individual rights of Americans in the future, that should be, anybody should be able to come in.
Yeah, I can't understand why people who claim to admire Ayn Rand, would oppose that. Would they keep Ayn Rand out of the country?
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I'm a strong believer in stringent background checks. And people point out to me they're expensive. I say, yeah, they are expensive, but they're vastly offset by immigrant productivity. I mean, with the creation of material and/or intellectual wealth by immigrants is staggering. I mean, let's just start with the intellectual wealth. Let's start with Ayn Rand, and Einstein and Ludwig von Mises and any number of geniuses who came here to escape from the Nazis or the communists. And then there's the material wealth. Well, I mean, Silicon Valley is just rife with, Asian immigrants or immigrants from other countries who, start their own software companies, from different countries.
Half of startups have an immigrant as one of the founders.
Yeah, Yahoo, Google, Sun Microsystems, right? I mean, Elon Musk is an immigrant. I love SpaceX. We talked about that
just to create some controversy. Steve Jobs' father was a Syrian.
Yeah, and you're an immigrant. I'm glad you're here. Yaron. My grandparents are immigrants. I'm glad I'm here. And how many Latino immigrants come here? One that start their own cleaning companies. Oh, yeah. Provide a valuable service, tend to work harder than many native-born Americans for less pay. There's this typical immigrant work ethic. So I want stringent background checks. I want violent criminals. I want jihadists. I want these MS-13, Trump's favorite gang. Want these guys out of the country. And anybody who's an honest person, come here and work. And of course, I don't tie this to the welfare state like the conservatives do, because I think the welfare state needs to be phased out on purely humanitarian grounds, regardless what our policy is on immigration. Welfare is harmful to the people who are forced to pay it. And above all, it's harmful to recipients who are on it, very often on it for many years.
So say a little bit about why welfare is harmful to recipients. And in a sense, that goes back to the issue about Black communities. I mean, I think, unfortunately, welfare has institutionalized many of them into poverty, and it's made them. It contributes to the victim culture.
Yeah, and the welfare state was really ramping up in the 1960s, 1950s, 1960s. Black Americans were still disproportionately poor, and the Marxists and the Democratic Party targeted them, and still do. And they don't care about Black lives. What the results. The results are hideous. But anyhow, so you have 8 families with dependent children. Right. So your mother's granted money for each child that they have, as long as there's no man in the home.
Yeah.
Because if there's a man in the home, he's expected to work, and provide for the family. Well, by the law of unintended but very predictable consequences, what that does is, you wave money in the face of any group, no matter how hardworking they tend to be. There's going to be some subset of them who is going to take the money, and the very predictable results is the illegitimacy rate in the Black community. I mean, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who's a very rational Democrat of the kind that don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
Moynihan would have to be Republican, I think, if he was in politics today.
I'm not sure he could be in politics in either party today.
Okay. Yeah. But, I think the Republicans are less bad, but we'll get to that. But anyway, Moynihan warned, I think it was 1965, that the illegitimacy rate in the Black community was 25%, and this was a problem. And of course, the leftists all screamed that he was a racist. Well, now the illegitimacy rate in the Black community is over 70% and higher in some of the real welfare neighborhoods. And so you have the tragedy of in many cases, children being raised without a father in the home, with a mother on welfare. Welfare money sometimes goes to drugs. And there's no other way. The leftists will scream that I'm a racist, but there's no other way to explain the conditions in these high crime neighborhoods, which are heavily correlated with welfare and very high illegitimacy rates. This amongst the Black community, which traditionally was the most Christian religious community in the country, would be the last American ethnic group that you would expect to see 70-something% illegitimacy rates. Christianity was so strong in that community, and the rural area still is, where you don't see those kind of illegitimacy rates.
The good thing is that a positive sign is that the illegitimacy rate is declining across the United States in all these communities. So for whatever reason, that is getting better, and hopefully we'll see the consequence of that more positive cultural.
Yeah, I know this guy's writing a book on the importance of fatherhood. He said to me, and he put it in a way that I had never thought of before. He said, one thing the world very badly needs is more fathers. And, I said, that's true. So many kids are raised, without a father, and there are mothers who do a great job as single moms. But still, I mean, you don't need to be an empirical psychologist to realize that it's best for a child to have a loving mother and a father. It's bad for the girls, and it's catastrophic for the boys to grow up without a father in the home. It's bad for the girls because a loving father sets a template for her as to what she would expect and demand from the man in her life when she reaches womanhood. But it's catastrophic for the boys to have a father who's good to his wife, who's loving to his children, who holds a job, and who's an honest person. Gives the boy a role model, what it means to be a man. He role models what it means to be a man. And so many of these kids growing up in the hood who join gangs, they don't have a father. They don't have a real family in that way. And the gang in a certain way represents family to them.
And it's so hard to raise a kid anyway, right? It's so much work, just sheer work, and requires focus and energy and time and effort and to do it alone. I mean, I think Leonard once said that the only reason he can come with to view polygamy as legitimate is the fact that you have to raise kids and two people is not enough. You need as many people as you can. So you might as well have bigger, but it truly is a lot of work. And for a single mother to raise one or two or three kids, it's just insanity. It's just for any single person, even if it was a man, it's just insane. Just in terms of the amount of focus and energy the kids require.
And no matter how
the idea of role models,
no matter how great she is, and there really are a lot of great single moms, and a lot of them, and a lot of them are black women. But no matter how great she is, she can't role model for her son what it means to be a man. Yep. She just says it's impossible. She can't. It's like with the identity politics thing. She could identify. She could claim to be a man, but she isn't. Biologically, she's his mom, not his dad.
We're gonna have the YouTube video, taken away by YouTube because you just said that. You can say a lot of things about a lot of stuff, but if you claim that a man is a man and a woman is a woman, then you're really.
Yeah, I know. That's really crossing a line, isn't it?
Those are issues I stay away from because that's a real dicey stuff.
Well, delete it before you put up again.
So is there a danger in letting too many people with incompatible values flood into the country and possibly change our culture and political system? This is on immigration.
Well, the history of immigration shows us, I think, and by the way, guys, everybody should read Thomas Sowell's book, Ethnic America. It's my favorite Thomas Sowell book. It was published, circa 1980. And he talks about the history of every ethnic group in the country. And very often, immigrant groups come in and mom and dad will want to stick to their old country ways. That's, they'll speak that language and eat that food and, embrace the old country religion. But over and over and over again, the children want to be Americans. They want to be real American kids. They want to learn to speak English. They want to, they want to listen to American music. They want to have American car. They want to go to American movies. The kids embrace American culture. So I think in a free country that celebrates America, that doesn't hate America, I think you're going to see the immigrant kids, like the immigrant kids in the past, embrace American values and American culture.
Absolutely. I mean, if we're confident in our own values, if we're confident in American culture and the principles of America, we're afraid of these foreign cultures coming in and polluting us. We're going to crush them, right? We're going to get their kids and they're going to become good Americans because we have pro-life values. We have values that, we have reasons behind them. We have everything going in our favor. Who are we afraid of exactly?
It's interesting. I wonder how many of the girls of immigrants, the daughters of immigrants from Saudi Arabia, and Iran and everything. I wonder how many of them want to,
wear burqa.
How many want to wear the shador and be covered head to foot? In my experience, again, anecdotal evidence, very limited, but my experience as my college students, these Muslim girls who are raised here, they want to be Americans. They don't want to be covered head to foot.
And this is an America that's not at its best. This is an America that celebrates multiculturalism and a lot of anti-Western stuff. Imagine America at its best. How immigrants would respond to that. It's a ludicrous argument in my view. What is your position about immigration today? So that would be the ideal, obviously, let them all in. But what do you think about today? So a lot of people tell me, today, because of the welfare state, because of multiculturalism, because of all these things, today we have to build walls. We have to stop them from coming in.
Well, again, I think we need to dismantle the welfare state, no matter what our position is on immigration. I don't think that package deal, is. I don't think we should think of it in terms of that package deal. Yep. And I think the labor force participation rates continue to show that immigrants have a stronger work ethic than most native-born Americans. They always did, and they still have. I think a lot of people are afraid of Latino immigrants in that regard, because very often they tend to have low education levels. But they remind me of what Thomas Sowell said about the Sicilian immigrants, 100 years ago, that the Sicilians had very low education and they didn't believe in education. They wanted the kids at home. They don't want them in the school. And it wasn't until like the 1960s that you start to see a lot of Italian kids go to college. But the Sicilians rose anyway, just as Thomas Sowell put it, by their willingness to work harder than anybody else, to take dirty jobs that other native-born Americans didn't want, work long hours. It's true that education can fuel affluence, but affluence can fuel education too. People have risen, the Sicilians, the Jews originally working in the sweatshops, rose out of poverty into middle class by means of this dirty, work that didn't have any required education. And then after that, their grandchildren, and their great grandchildren all, went to college. So the Latino immigrants, to put it simply, they work harder than anybody else. I mean, people think hard. I want them in the country. Can I suggest a trade? I'd want to trade, 10 million white, native-born, male, Marxist intellectuals to these Latino countries for 10 million, non-white, non-male or male, whatever, doesn't matter, hard-working, honest immigrants who want to come here to work and not turn the country into a communist dictatorship. Can we make that offer to Venezuela? Yes, send Venezuela our white Marxist intellectuals and bring them their hard-working people here.
Absolutely. People think, when they think about Jewish immigrants, they think of a bunch of lawyers and doctors came here from Europe. But that our ancestors grew up in little shtetls, little villages. They knew nothing. They were uneducated. They were farmers. They had nothing. They knew nothing. They came on boats here, and they did the crappy jobs that they had to do in order to survive. But they valued education. And they got their kids educated, and they worked harder than anybody else. And within a generation or two, they were middle class. But they came here with literally nothing. They were running away from Eastern Europeans trying to slaughter them, and they didn't take anything because they had nothing in their little villages.
Yeah, again, Thomas Sowell in Ethnic America makes the startling claim that the Jewish immigrants in the United States were the poorest immigrants ever. That's saying something, given how poor the Irish and the Sicilians were. But you're right, the pogroms in Eastern Europe were terrible. The Jews were persecuted horribly. It came here. And as always, here's the two keys to rise in a free country: hard work and education. If you emphasize that for your if you work hard and you emphasize education for your kids in a free country, the kids will rise, whether they speak the language originally or not, whatever their skin color is, their religion, honest hard work and education. Those are the keys. And that's why the Black Caribbean immigrants have risen. That's why the Black African immigrants have risen, and it's the same for the Latinos. If they're honest hard workers and they're not criminals, then they're not jihadists. Let them in. Let
them in. All right, couple of quick questions, and then we'll go on to talking about Republicans and Democrats.
Well, actually, let me say one last thing, Yaron. Yep. The welfare state is overwhelmingly a problem of native-born Americans. It's not a problem of immigrants in the United States.
And so is multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is a problem of native-born intellectuals.
Right. Yeah. Marxist.
And they preach it. If you want to blame anybody for the problems of this country, it's not immigrants. It's native-born Americans, from the progressive era. Granted, back in the 19th century, they were immigrants, mainly from Germany, by the way, who came here and brought Hegelian, Kantian, and Marxist ideas to America, institutionalized them into our universities, and have dominated those universities since then. And that is why we're in the shape we're in, not because of any immigrants to this country.
You're right. And they're overwhelmingly white males, by the way. Now, you and I, from the contemporary, leftist mentality, we're just a couple of old white men, so we won't be listened to. Old white men aren't listened to unless you're Bernie Sanders, right? Then that's the exception.
That's right. You have to go good Marxist Jewish white male, and then they'll listen to you.
I don't particularly like Jews, Yaron, but Marxist.
I don't know how Bernie Sanders got away with the Jewish part of it. I have no idea.
Well, he's a hardcore Marxist, so they
he's a Jew-hating Jew. I mean,
he's a hardcore Marxist, so they forgive him.
Where do you draw the line between the government protecting us from contagious diseases and the government protecting us from natural disasters?
Well, that's an interesting question. Like, I'm just a kid from Brooklyn. Protecting us from natural disasters.
I would say that the difference is that natural disasters are not carried by human beings. Stuff happens. And it's not that the government should protect us from the consequence of contagious diseases. What the government should do is help us protect us from getting contagious diseases. And they do that by isolating the people who have the contagious disease. That is, if you have a contagious disease, one that kills people, then you are a threat to the individual rights, in other words, the lives of other people. And it's completely legitimate for the government to isolate you until you're healthy, until you're well. And if you're coming into the country, it's completely legitimate for the government not to allow you in. And we know that from things like tuberculosis. We isolate people who have tuberculosis. We don't let people in who have tuberculosis. So the one is carried by human beings. The other is what they call acts of God. It's just nature. Okay, last question before we get to, but it's a good bridge. Many in the Democratic Party want reparations for blacks based on immigration of the last 100 years. How do you justify reparations when recent immigrants are not responsible for slavery of the 18th century?
Well, slavery reparations is maybe the most insane idea from the insane left that I have ever heard. It's pure collectivism, because even if your ancestors were here, you're not responsible. I'm not responsible for what my grandparents did. Neither are you. Nobody is. The descendants of slaves aren't slaves. The people who deserve the reparations have been dead for 100 years or more, and the people who will be forced to pay reparations have been dead for 100 years. This collectivist notion that we're responsible for what our ancestors did, it's irrational and it's pernicious. If that's the case, Yaron, then we should force the Egyptians to pay you and I reparations because our ancestors were enslaved there, 3,000 years ago or whatever. And it never ends. It'll never end. There's always, if you trace the history back far enough, every group's ancestors have some legitimate grievance.
Absolutely.
But it happened hundreds of years ago, 1,000 years ago. The key point is, we're responsible for what we do. We're not responsible for what other people do, including our ancestors. That's the key principle.
And the fight should be to abolish and get rid of whatever remnants of racism on any side exist today. And that's an intellectual battle. And that's a battle that has to reject collectivism in all forms, including the kind of collectivism that animates the whole reparations movement. But unfortunately, collectivism, I think, is on the rise. On both sides of the political spectrum of today. So let's jump into Democrats, Republicans, left versus right. And let me start out by conceding. There's no question that the nutty left, we'll call it the nutty left, right? That's right. Because radical is too good for them, right? Radical means bold and consistent. They're not radicals. They're nutty. They're insane. And even Marxism, I have to say that even calling them Marxist is too nice, right? These are so many of them are nihilists. And Marx, with all his flaws, he led to nihilism, and he had to, and he led to the destruction. but he had a particular ideology. These people have nothing. They have emotion. They spew emotions. They spew hatred. They spew destruction. So it's a kind of a nihilist left. There's no question in my mind that the nihilist left, and particularly the intellectuals in the nihilist left, are far more dominant than anybody on the right. Because they dominate the educational institutions. They're far more destructive, right? If you handed them the keys to anything, they would just blow it up. They would just destroy it. They don't have any positive agenda. They're not linked to anything positive. They just want to destroy for the sake of destruction. And there is no idea more evil, if you will, than egalitarianism, than the notion of equality of outcome. And equality of outcome, not just, as the Khmer Rouge proved, not just in the realm of wealth, but in every realm, right? You kill people because they're smart. You kill people because they're educated. You destroy everything. There is no set of ideas, in my view, more destructive than what the nutty left today holds. So I agree completely. You know, I'm not here as a defender of the left in any respect. My argument is this. My argument is those ideas will never dominate. Those ideas will always be fringe. They'll always push the country in an awful direction. But Americans will always reject it. It goes back to Ayn Rand's idea that Americans will never be socialists. I think the real threat to America is fascism. I think the real threat to America is fascism, I think animated by religion, because I think Americans are more religious than they'd like to admit. And I think what the left does, the real danger of the left, beyond the damage that they do on a day-to-day basis, is that they embolden the right. They embolden the fascists. They embolden the racists, the nationalists, the religionists of within the Republican Party to become more and more dangerous. And I think that the existential danger to this country, to our freedoms, comes from people who call themselves today conservatives and call themselves of the right. I think the left is insane and nutty, but it's just fodder. It's just what will create the circumstances which will lead to the rise of the right. Just like in ominous parallels and just like in Leonard's dim hypothesis, which is kind of an updating.
Yeah, well, I think I agree with you about the one point anyway, that the so-called alt-right or the National Socialist left, as I think of them, as a reaction against the insane Marxist left. I think that's true. I think they make the other side stronger. But I hope you are right about the insane Marxist left, because I'm not that sanguine about their lack of efficacy. Notice, for example, the Democrat. Now, Bernie Sanders didn't get the nomination this year. He may never because of age. But some younger Bernie Sanders clone, that's the trend line of the Democratic Party. You're on whether
Biden
it's
the same age, right? Biden is older than Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, but I mean, 4 years from now, Comrade Bernie may be too old, or 8 years. But in the future, I mean, some younger version of Bernie Sanders, whether it's Ocasio-Cortez, or somebody like that, will be the Democratic nominee, because that's been their trend line for a long time, and they are just insane. I mean, if they get in power, let's say they control the presidency in both houses of Congress, just on the climate change issue alone, I would vote against them. I mean, they want to curtail our use of fossil fuels, which will wreck the world economy, not just the United States. And there's no offsetting gain, because in reality, climate change is overwhelmingly natural. It's not man-made, and warming is good anyway. Warming is beneficial to life on Earth. It's the colder periods that are harmful. They're absolutely insane on this issue, and they'll wreck the economy over nothing. Just on that issue alone, I'm going to vote Republican.
Yeah, I don't think it works exactly that way. So I agree about climate change. We're not going to disagree about the Green New Deal. My view is we'll get all that from the Republicans. But
take
a Republican who's not alt-right, because alt-right is too easy, and they're like the nutty left. They're somewhat marginalized and they're somewhere out there. But take a Republican who I think is rising in popularity right now. He's a first-term senator from Kansas and Nebraska. This guy Foley, right? I think his name's Foley. The guy is a leftist on economics. On almost every economic issue, he's a leftist. He wants industrial policy for the United States. He wants the government to decide who we can trade with, where companies can start businesses, where they build factories, how much they pay employees. You know, like Tucker Carlson hates Wall Street, hates private equity, hates restructuring American business, hates technology. They hate big tech. They want to do away with big tech. They want to destroy the economics. But, and this is the real danger in my view, they do it in the name of America. They do it in the name of capitalism. They do it in the name of the right, you know, the traditional, what they consider the right. And Hawley is, of course, in addition to all of that, is a nutty religionist. I mean, on the nutty side. He is the rising star within the Republican Party right now. And you know, I think much more efficacious. I mean, one of the dangers about Republicans I see is they actually can get things done. Yeah. I mean, the worst thing in politics, in my view, is when the Republicans and Democrats agree. Like when there's a bipartisan bill, I say run for the hills, right? Because the only thing Republicans and Democrats agree on is taking away some freedom that we still have, right? That's the only thing the two parties can agree on. You know, I still think that there's nobody the problem with the Republicans when they do this is there's nobody to oppose them, right? There's nobody to stand up and say, this is insane, stop doing it, right? And on the economic issues, but even the cultural issues, on the cultural issues, they actually have kind of a more high ground. So if, you know, my ideal situation, and it's been like this for a long time. I've said this many times, and unfortunately, politics are not swayed by my preferences. I would like a Democratic president and a Republican House and Senate in the world in which we live in today, given the alternatives we have today. If I go back to because those are the only times when you actually get very little done. Those are the only times when they're violating our rights, you know, in spite of how awful Obama was. Most of the really bad stuff that he did in the first 2 years when he had a House and Senate that were Democrats. Right. As soon as the Republican took over, they shut him down. And Republicans are a very good opposition party. They just suck at actual, and when Republicans have the House, the Senate, and the presidency, you get the biggest government spending ever. You get crazy policies across the board. And you saw that with Trump. You saw that with Bush. You know, Bush was insane what they did in the 6 years that he had the Senate and House. They do nothing positive. I can't think of a single positive thing that the Bush administration, in terms of legislation, during those 6 years. It was all increasing regulations, increasing controls, and so my view is you want divided government, and the best divided government so far that I've seen is when you have a Republican House and Senate and they act as opposition to a Democratic president.
You know, I understand that. I do. Given the, you know, I'm not going to defend the Republicans. I'm just going to argue that the Democrats are worse. Not going to be hard. Yeah, but the you know, divided government in that way is the best we can do given the premises of the two parties. But you know, I think on policy issues, you know, the Republicans tend to be, I'm not going to say they're better because that's too positive in my judgment, but they're less bad. I mean, they're less bad on climate change. I think they're less bad on guns. And I don't want to underestimate the power of the left, the insane left, Yaron. They control the intellectual culture. If they control the presidency as well, and you're very often, you know, if Obama was popular, they did take control of they had control of Congress by then, right? I think
they had control. You know, Bill Clinton was a Democratic president. I mean, he was bad, but the world didn't end. Bill Clinton
was a small government Democrat, though. He wasn't this hardcore leftist.
Oh, remember, he started out being a big government Democrat, and he moderated because the Republicans and ultimately the electorate forced him to. Remember Hillary Care, right? The first thing the Clintons did was try to nationalize healthcare, and they failed. And Obama was pretty nutty on the left, although the leftists think he was too centrist, he was too moderate, right? If you listen to the nut, and he did damage, but in my view, what Trump has done is far more damaging than what Obama did. In Trump's first 4 years, I think he's discredited the presidency, the Republican Party, any kind of sanity in Washington, and the way he's dealt with this, the coronavirus is so pathetic that somebody has to pay a price for this. You can't just say, okay, the president just completely blew a major issue, and we're going to vote for him because the other side is worse. I just, I can't vote for a guy who is as incompetent and has the moral character. We talked about character earlier. There's nothing more important to me ultimately than character. This guy has a moral character of a. I don't want to say it because everybody's gonna flip on me, but I mean, he not only doesn't deserve to be in the White House, he doesn't deserve anything. I mean, this guy is horrific in terms of his character, and I think he's taken the presidency, he's taken politics to a new low in ways that I don't think can be tolerated. I just don't think we can tolerate it. So, I mean, I wouldn't normally say vote Democratic, but I'd say, although I did, I think the world would be a better place today if John Kerry had won in 2004. But that's, I think the financial crisis would have been blamed on something different than what it was blamed on. I think Iraq and so on would have happened differently, and I don't think we would have had Obama or Trump. So I think long-term impacts of these things, they make a difference. And I think Trump has to suffer the consequences of his failures over the last 4 years.
Well, I get your point, but again, I don't want to underestimate the dangers of the Marxist left. They control the intellectual culture. If they also control the government, that just makes them enormously dangerous on any number of issues: climate change, guns, welfare state, the push towards socialism, foreign policy. I mean, Trump took out this Iranian terrorist, which is killing Iranian terrorists is good.
And then he walked away.
Yeah, but I know, but he killed the Iranian terrorists. All the Democrats scream, bloody murder. Haven't heard.
Measures are sometimes worse than no measures.
Yeah, but I haven't heard from ISIS recently. Did Trump bomb them into oblivion? I mean, I hope so. And then on education,
I'm dubious. I'm dubious on ISIS, but I think Putin bombed them into oblivion because Putin supported Bashar al-Assad, who they have no qualms about destroying. I mean, who actually won that militarily? I'm very dubious about Trump's contribution to that. And of course, Trump also emboldened the Turks and stabbed in the back the Kurds, who are only allies in that region. And he literally stabbed them in the back on a phone call with an authoritarian. He backs Putin. I know Bolton's book is very divisive out there, but I know John Bolton a little bit, but I've been following his career for a long time. I'll take Bolton's word over Trump's any day. And if the book is half right, if just half of what he said is true, Trump is treasonous. I mean, in his foreign policy, treasonous, because he's placed the interests of Saudi Arabia and Russia and China over our own interests. So foreign policy, I think, is being the worst of all of them. Now, on deregulation, particularly in the energy space, on education, although weak on education, because you'd expect by now the Department of Education to be a lot smaller than it is, they've done a little bit. So, on certain policy issues, things have moved in the right direction. I'm not going to deny that. There's no question.
I'm not going to defend Trump, but I'm just the parties here, the Democrats and the Republicans, the entire party, the entire Democratic Party is moving towards socialism. They hate America. They hate capitalism. They're nihilists, like you said. I don't think the Republican Party in general is that bad. You've got people like Nikki Haley. I like Nikki Haley. I like Christy. I like Christy Noam, the governor, in South Dakota, who refused to lock down the state. And she said freedom works. The Republicans still have people like that. There's nobody in the Democratic Party like that anymore. The party of Harry Truman, John Kennedy, Scoop Jackson, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, people who, however much I might have disagreed with their specific policies, they loved America. They were willing to defend America. I mean, John Kennedy was as much a Cold Warrior as Ronald Reagan was. There's nobody in the Democratic Party like that anymore. The Republicans still have some people people. I agree with you. I don't like Trump, but the Republicans still have some people where they're better on climate change. They're better on guns. They're better on the welfare state. They'll defend the country more than the Democrats will. And on education, if there's any hope for tax credits and or privatization, it's got to come from the Republicans, because the Democrats
it's not going to come from the federal
completely
government.
in bed with the teachers union,
Sure.
one of the most despicable organizations in the country.
Absolutely. But it can't come from the federal government, because tax credits are going to have to come from the states. I mean, states control education. Federal government can do
The Republicans will do a better job, as governor or state legislatures.
I'm not going to argue against voting Republican on a governor and a governorship. I'm not going to. I don't think I've ever supported voting Democratic to a governor, although I'm sure there's some governors I would not vote for. Republicans generally at the state level do better than Democrats, but I fear this generation of Republicans at the federal level. I fear their nationalism. Nationalism is a rising trend. I mean, there's this, I don't know if you've noticed this new movement called National Conservatives. They've got conferences, journals. It's a big intellectual movement, which is basically a proto-fascist movement. And it's real intellectuals, usually Catholics, very religious, really, really dangerous. Look, I don't want Democrats to control all houses of government. Absolutely not. But I think one has to penalize somebody like Trump. One cannot vote for an immoral SOB like he is. And I'd vote Republican in the House and Senate across the board to prevent the Democrats from holding those, and vote against Trump, not for anybody, but against Trump for president.
No, I understand. I'm going to vote against the Democrats. I'm not voting for Trump. I'm going to vote against the Democrats. I think, there's certain, you can make a case anyway that, Trump's tax reforms help fuel the economy before the virus. The economy was doing well after it had a tank for many years under Bush and Obama.
So if you look at the economy from 2009 into January, almost no difference between Trump and Obama. Really no difference. 2% growth, 2.2 maybe percent growth, marginal benefits at most. I mean, here's a president who is arguing that the Federal Reserve should have negative interest rates. I mean, do you know what negative interest rates would do to this country? It is insanity. Trump is no better than I'd say centrist Democrats on economic issues. He is the most ignorant president in economics that I know of. The damage he's done on trade, and people say China, forget China. Trade with Canada, trade with Brazil, trade with Europe is a disaster. But also negative interest rates. Negative interest rates. If he gets his way with the Federal Reserve, we will pay for this. I mean, Europe has negative interest rates, and they've grown less than we have. There's very, and again, he has diminished this presidency. He has made the presidency. I mean, he lies in ways that are new to even to politicians who are liars to begin with, right? Because he doesn't care. He doesn't care if he's caught, because as long as it works, he's literally, I've heard him say this. It worked. Why do we care if I lied or not? It worked. He is. You remember what Ayn Rand called JFK? I mean, you're praising JFK, which is. I mean, I agree with you, because now JFK seems like, whoa.
Yeah.
But you remember what Ayn Rand called him? I mean,
the fascist new frontier. And there's a lot of things about John Kennedy to dislike, but the one thing he did was he was willing to defend America. He would not tolerate offensive missiles in Cuba. And if he went into politics today, I think he'd probably have to be Republican, because there's no place for him in the Democratic Party. But anyhow, my point is, if we elect, I get your point. I don't want to argue against a straw man. You want divided government. I get it.
I do.
I'm not going to argue. So I'm not going to argue against a fully democratic government. But I do think Trump is better than whatever we're going to get from Biden. Now, poor Biden, it seems like he's losing his faculties, and I don't want to make fun of that. I don't. My dad died of Alzheimer's, and it's horrible. Biden comes in, he's controlled by the Democratic Party, who are hardcore leftists, and I think Trump is less bad. I think the economy did grow more than under Obama. I think more than any Republican, he has the courage to call out the news media, fake news. They are liars. That it's in their DNA. The New York Times has been lying since Walter Duranty stood up for Stalin in the 1930s.
That's very dangerous for the president of the United States.
So I know
media the way he does. It is so, he shows so little respect for the First Amendment, so little respect for freedom of the press. And he says he has no respect for the freedom of the press. So he doesn't do it in the name of, pointing this out. And the way he praises news organizations that support his agenda, it is so fascist-like. It's so authoritarian-like. I like the media that praises me. Whether they're accurate or not doesn't matter. I hate those guys because they don't praise me. And whether it's true or not doesn't matter. It's not about calling them out because they're wrong. It's about calling them out because they don't like him, because he's a pure narcissist and an emotionalist. And to reward somebody like that who has no respect for the First Amendment, zero, to reward him with a second term after we've seen what he is willing to say, to me, that sends a signal, which is the end of this. I really have come to think of a Trump second presidency as the end of this country. I mean, I'm not now, and I think there's a balance to a Biden, right? I think that Republicans rise up to the challenge, if you will, of being in the opposition. There's nothing, because everybody agrees about the death of the First Amendment. It's not like the left is going to argue with Trump for freedom of the press. They don't believe in it either. But so what you're getting is basically a destruction of the Republican Party, which is what Trump is doing. He's destroying the Republican Party. He's making it into a authoritarian party, and the destruction of free speech and destruction of individualism and capitalism and everything. There's still remnants of goodness in the Republican Party. Because I agree with you, there are good people there. I'd vote for Nikki Haley tomorrow. I would too. I wish he would walk away and have a replacement. And I don't think Nikki Haley's, she's not going to solve our problems, but she's better than anybody else I see out there.
Right, I agree. I'd like to see in a certain way, an all-female Republican ticket in 4 years. Nikki Haley and Kristi Noem.
I don't think Noem well.
She's the governor of South Dakota, and she refused to lock down the state, and she said freedom works, and but anyway, she's a supporter of freedom. Now, a lot of times when these people get into power, they tend to lose their principles and they become much more pragmatic. But I want to give Trump some credit here, because he's not threatening the news media. He's telling the truth. They're liars. They're so dishonest. They've been dishonest. But
I agree with you. Of course, they're dishonest. We all know they're dishonest.
Finally, somebody called them out and said fake news, and he's right. And all the Republicans kowtowed before that. They don't want to, make waves with the media. Trump tells them to go bleep themselves. I think he's right. And he's not
the way he does it.
He's not threatening their freedom of speech. He doesn't threaten their freedom of speech.
You're reading into what he does, what you want, because it's not. That's not how it comes out. I mean, he keeps saying, "I want to sue them for libel. I want to shut them down." I mean, he implies it constantly that he, as president of the United States, not as a private citizen, as president of the United States, would like to shut them down. This is not just calling them out on fake news. This is about the government, the president of the United States, actually, threatening news media with the power of the state. Now, he doesn't have that power. Thank God we're still in a country that still respects that, right? But he is moving the Republican Party, and you can see it in their attitude to big tech and the attitude to social media. We are moving this country away from any kind of respect for the First Amendment in the Republican Party. And we know how, we agree on the importance of the First Amendment.
Absolutely.
In that. But the Republican Party, even Ted Cruz, the way he attacked Facebook and the way he attacks, and he was supposed to be the pro-capitalist, pro-constitution guy. The Republican Party under Trump, and I don't think it would have happened without Trump, is moving dramatically away from any respect from what I think are the most important characteristics of this country. And I'm getting creamed on the chat.
Well, again, Trump doesn't have the power to put the press out of business. Once he's a private citizen, again, he could sue. He could sue whoever he wants. He can't do it as POTUS. He doesn't have that power. Nobody's afraid of that. But he did call attention to the fact how dishonest they are. I've known that since the 1960s, since I was a kid. That I haven't read the New York Times or watched CBS News. They were lying about Vietnam. They lie about everything. So I'm glad that Trump, called them fake news. The economy does do better under the Republicans generally than under the Democrats.
Not true.
They do better under Trump than under Obama. I think the Republicans are more likely to defend the country against the bad guys than the Democrats. So I'd rather have a Republican government than a divided government with a Democrat as president.
So the stats are very clear. The government spending, the best for government spending is a Republican president, a Democratic president, a Republican House and Senate. By far, that is the best combination. Second best combination is a Republican president, the Democratic House and Senate. The third worst is all Republican. And the worst overall is all Democratic. But divided government is by far, from an economic perspective, better, and has been since World War II, better than unified government. Divided government from every economic perspective is better. Stock market does better. Stock market did better under Bill Clinton, actually did better under Obama. But the economy did not. I mean, I think it's a myth, and Trump is very good at repeating these things over and over again. But in 2019, the economy of the United States grew at 2%. That's pathetic, to put it mildly. And everything was going his way. He had the levers of power. So tax cuts were good, and I'm all for tax cuts. So. But his other policies defeated the benefits of those tax cuts and the deregulations that they passed. So no, I don't think I think Trump's presidency, the guy, anybody who thinks that the murderous dictator of North Korea is his best buddy is somebody I can, just that would disqualify him, in my view, from voting.
He came away from that meeting with Kim Jong-un and said, the North Korean people love Kim Jong-un, and I mean, my jaw hit the floor. That's something I would have expected Obama to say, not not Trump. So I mean, I agree with you on that. That was despicable. The POTUS should not say despicable things about a totalitarian leader like that. Yeah. Nevertheless, he's the guy who supports Israel, who's our only ally in the Middle East. He's the guy who'll take out Iranian terrorists. If Putin knocked out ISIS, then there's one thing that Putin I'll applaud, to raise him one rung in hell. But I think Trump had Trump had something to do with eliminating ISIS. I think he'll defend the country more than Biden or any of the Democrats. I'm much more confident.
He's a guy who invited the Taliban. He invited the Taliban to Camp David to sign a peace treaty, which he then negated on, but he was willing to have the Taliban flying to Washington, D.C. and go to Camp David. He has no concept of defending this country. He doesn't know who our enemies are. I mean, he is totally clueless. And once in a while, he has had decent advisors around him, and most of the times he hasn't or ignored them. Yeah, I mean, we'll agree to disagree, I guess, but I will.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you about Trump. It's just my whole point is the Democrats are worse, and why I don't want Biden in power is because they are the political wing of the insane left, and just going to get more and more, about white supremacy, white, privilege, white racism. We're going to get the push towards curtailing fossil fuels to solve the climate change non-crisis. Getting more and more money poured into the government schools without any possibility, of moving towards tax credits or privatization.
Federal government,
they're abominable. I can't vote for them. I agree with you about Trump, Yaron, with a few minor. I agree with you about Trump, with a few minor quibbles. It's that Trump is bad and the Republicans are bad and Trump is terrible. I just think the Democrats are worse, and they hate America in the way that the Republicans don't.
And I agree with that. Although I think the Republicans are more likely to take us in a anti-American direction, because again, I think they rally the country in ways that the Democrats do. The thing I think happens to the Democrats, and you saw that with Obama and you saw that with Clinton, is when they get into power, they can't actually do all these horrific things that they want to do. and it stops them. And my only hope is that if Trump is thoroughly defeated in this election, that way of thinking among Republicans gets crushed and marginalized. That in the next election, somebody like Nikki Haley or somebody even better, I can dream. Allow me to dream.
Yeah,
somebody better comes around, and then I'll be happy to support them, right? But I actually think that once in a while the Republicans need to get slapped. Once in a while the Republicans need to be defeated because they're moving in an anti-American direction, which is I think what they're doing right now. And again, it's not that I'm voting for the Democrats' agenda. I would never do that. It's that I'm voting against Republicans because they need to wake up and they need to reset their course, and they won't. As long as Trump is their leader, they will move they continue to move in the wrong direction. They will continue to move this country in the wrong direction, and they'll make the Democrats worse. And that's the thing. I think what we're seeing today is the Democrats are becoming much worse and the Republicans are becoming much worse. And I think that's the Trump effect. I think that's
I get your point, but I half agree. The Democrats are becoming much worse. I think the Republicans are becoming marginally worse. Remember, Obama did get Obamacare through Congress, so the Democrats get some horrendous things done.
He did that when he had the House and Senate.
Yeah, I know you're not arguing for unified government. I get it, but the Democrats do get horrendous things done. And I'm not suggesting that the Democrats could yet get the Green New Deal through Congress. But 10 years down the road, 15, 20 years down the road, I think that's what's coming. This is the party of nihilistic destruction. And they're the ones who need to be slapped across the face even harder than the Republicans do.
There's no way for them to go. That's the problem with the Democrats. There's no way for them to go. It's all downhill. The Republicans still might have a hope, but the Democrats have no hope. So the only political party that will wake up if they get slapped are the Republicans. But ideally, and again, this is my hoping because I don't think it'll be a reality. This is the way I'd like the slapping to go, right? Because I've been slapping, right? As I'd like the Republicans to get slapped on the presidency, and I'd like the Democrats to get slapped where the radicals live, and that's in the House of Representatives. So my ideal outcome from this next election is Republicans retake the House. And get
Omar out of office, right?
Get Omar out of office, get AOC out of office, although that won't happen because she's from New York.
She's from New York, yeah.
But you get, you slap the Democrats at the House. The Republicans keep the Senate, which they probably won't. They'll probably lose the Senate. And Biden is a lame duck, right? And he's there and he can't do anything because Republicans control both. And Republicans learn that Trump is unacceptable. That, to me, is the ideal outcome. Now, I think what's going to happen, unfortunately, is I think Trump will lose, and I think Republicans will lose the House and the Senate, and the Democrats will have all three. Because and that, to me, is a consequence of the Republicans backing Trump. That, to me, is what Trump has done to the Republican Party, is make them so unappealing that Americans just won't vote for them across the board.
See, I think, unfortunately, you may be right. But that's a consequence of the leftist intellectuals controlling the universities and the school system. And more than half the voters are socialists now. I mean, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, 4 years ago. Gore won the popular vote in 2000. The country has moved more and more to the nutty is too weak a word, the insane Marxist left. And
look, the only reason I think Trump is president is because the left controls the universities. I mean, I don't think Trump, in any kind of sane world, in a world where these nuts don't control the university, could have won. He won as a backlash against the elites, who are the elites? They're the crazy leftists, the New York Times, who ran more stories about transgender issues than about the economy. Leading up to the 2016 election, and most Americans rebelled against it. Americans are not enamored with the nutty left, but the danger I see is that Americans, I think, are susceptible to the fascist right. And to me, that is where we're heading. We're heading the left. Let me just play this out. The left's going to win at some point. Let's say now it wins, and it does these horrible things. Americans won't buy it. And what they'll elect to replace them is somebody authoritarian and nutty, and it will take this country towards fascism. And it will blame the left because it'll be their fault in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's a grim situation. I agree with you. But we have a divided country. I mean, it's divided along rural urban lines. The urban areas are heavily Democratic, and that's where most people live. So I think most of the electorate is Democratic leftist, and they are enamored of the insane left, and that's terrifying. And
the rural side is unsophisticated, tends to be more religious, and is, I think, I see this among Republicans. I mean, immigration, I think, is a great issue. When I go and speak to a Republican audience and I mention immigration, I get booed off the stage. They won't let me talk. And it's even though you stand for background checks to keep criminals and jihadists out. Absolutely.
Yeah, they
literally boo me off the stage. And I never thought I'd see that. That happened in 2016 and since, right? Never used to happen, right? I think
horrifying.
I think we should be horrified. We should be terrified of what's coming. Okay, we got a few questions, and then we should probably wrap it up. We've gone 2 hours. Let's see. Okay, if Trump wins in 2020, can Republicans move away from his ways, nationalism, tariffs in 2024, and move towards liberty like a Mike Lee or Nikki Haley? See, I think no. That's why I don't support Trump. I think Andy is more optimistic that they can move away from Trumpism and embrace some of the better candidates in the future.
Yeah,
I think that's a danger.
So to me, yeah, I hear you, Yaron. But to me, the danger is that the insane left is pushing us towards race war, class war, civil war, and that's really what I'm terrified of. A second U.S. Civil War, which would really be rural versus urban, and different areas seceding from the Union. I see that could happen in the next 20 years. I mean, I'd become much more pessimistic about the future of our country. And the culprit here is the insane Marxist left, not so much the nationalist religious.
But I think the nationalist religious will be the biggest beneficiaries of the nutty left. Again, I don't think the nutty left can rule. I think the rulers will be from the fascist right, and I think they'll unify the country, because as we started out in places like, communism has never succeeded as a ruling ideology in the West, and I don't think it will. I think what happens is when the communists get power or seem like they're getting power, people gravitate towards a dictator, authoritarian on the other side, or not the other side, the same side.
No, I get you.
That's what happened. That's what will happen here, and that's what we're heading towards. And they're preparing. So this nationalist conservative movement, which is big, it's not marginal. It's not a few little people. These are the leading intellectuals on the right today. They are prepping for that. There's the book by an Israeli of all people, Yoram Hazony, about the virtues of nationalism, which is a huge hit among Republicans now. And it's all over the place, and they're doing conferences about it. They've got journals on it. And the intellectuals of the right are preparing for the day where they take over. And they know that the Marxists on the left are pushing the country in their direction. They benefit when the Marxists go up. When monuments are toppled, the people celebrating deep down inside of the other nationalists, because they know the country won't tolerate that, and they're going to vote. I think if Trump wins, it's going to be because of the kooky left doing what they're doing right now on the streets of America. People will say, we don't want that, because they don't want complete anarchy. What they want is order, and a candidate who brings them order. But to hell with the First Amendment, to hell with all these other things. I think Americans will vote for that. That's what scares me.
What scares me is I think we're going to get a divided country. I don't think the nationalist, fascist types that you're talking about, who maybe would be popular in rural areas, they'll never win over the Marxist leftists in the cities and in the universities. And I think we're going to splinter into different countries. The East Coast, maybe the East Coast, the West Coast are one country, and Mid-America is another country, maybe even tinier fiefdoms like happens near the end of Atlas Shrugged. But I don't see a nationalist Trump-like leader, uniting the country. The leftists just hate him. They'll never get behind him, and they control the cities. They're more than 50% of the electorate. I mean, we saw that. Even Hillary Clinton, as terrible a candidate as she was, outpolled Trump in all the major urban areas.
I know. Imagine, but here's a nightmare for you.
Yeah.
Imagine a religionist who's also an environmentalist.
Al Gore. Al Gore.
Yeah, Al Gore's. I mean, imagine a charismatic evangelical type who's also, a nationalist type, pro-American, waves the flag, does all the stuff, right? Who's also rabidly environmentalist. That to me is how you unite, right, in quotes, the country. And
Yeah,
that's what keeps me up at night. That's what terrifies me.
That's a possibility. A hardcore religionist, the middle America get behind them. A hardcore environmentalist wants to push through the Green New Deal. The urban areas would get behind them. Yeah, then you could have a hybrid dictatorship that's partially religious and partially hardcore leftist.
Somebody says we've got the perfect candidate, Tucker Carlson. All right, let's see. We've got a few others. Yaron, fear not. With Kanye West's presidential leadership, Kanye, I don't know if you saw this, but Kanye West.
I'll vote for him over Biden. I'll tell you that.
I'll vote for him over Trump.
Yeah.
America will enter a new golden age where objectivism will be embraced.
That's funny, but yeah, I hope Kanye gets. Well, obviously Trump's going to be the nominee, but all we need for your nightmare vision to come true, Yaron, is for AOC to embrace religion.
Right.
And then we have the candidate, and she's a woman, which helps. She's attractive, sort of. It could
be a leftist who moves towards religion. It could be somebody on the right who moves towards environmentalism. It could happen in either direction. I don't know where it comes from. If you look at Hawley, I mean, look at the senator from Kansas or Nebraska, I forget. He's scary, and he's got the right characteristics. Why do communists have such bad aesthetics?
Bad aesthetics? They murdered 100 million people by conservative estimate, and we're concerned about their aesthetics. I mean, how about why do communists have such bad ethics? But the aesthetics, I think. What do the communists like to say? Is everything's political. Everything's politics. Everything's
political. Well,
art has to be politics. It has to support the workers' state. So it's all socialist realism. It's just dreck. It commits the cardinal literary sin in literature. It's boring. Yeah. It's just boring.
And the Nazis did the same thing. Remember how much time Hitler spent on architecture and sculpture and these things. And it was the same kind of social realism. It was this horrible, boring, but also very materialistic, right? So the statues of this masculine men with no soul, no life. It's just muscles. It's ugly stuff. But it's not surprising that people committed to slaughtering tens of millions of people have no aesthetic appreciation. For some reason, it doesn't shock me at all.
Well, when everything is swallowed up by politics, then when the arts are swallowed by politics, then art is the handmaiden of whatever the dictator says it is, and creativity is going to be squashed.
Absolutely. Jad asks, and we'll make this the last question: how are you defining environmentalist? I mean, I'm defining it as somebody who views nature as an end in itself, and that human beings, almost by default, the way we survive is by changing nature. Therefore, human beings are evil because they're changing nature constantly. That is, environmentalism places the so-called environment as an end in itself, Mother Nature or whatever, not as a means to human beings' life.
Right, absolutely. And they even have a theory. It's called the intrinsic value of nature. Yes. Right. This, to me, this is environmentalism. I agree with you, Yaron, that the pristine wilderness, nature as an end in itself, not as any instrumental ends to human felicity or human prosperity. And they on that vision, anything human beings do to improve our lives, cut down forests for agriculture, build cities, dig mines for ore and stuff, is trammeling the purity of untainted nature. We're necessarily trespassing on nature. So, environmentalists place the intrinsic value of nature above and before any values of human being. They're enemies of human life, and they're on the left right now. Your vision may come true one day. They may unite with the religious conservatives. I hope not. It'd be a nightmare vision. But yeah, they're the part of the loony left, and they're one reason why I want the Republicans in office, not the Democrats.
All right. Quick question. Difference between nationalism and patriotism. I just say nationalism is the elevation of the nation above the individual. It's place in so-called, in quotes, interests of the nation above the interest of the individual. Patriotism is the love of country, and good patriotism is the love of country that's justified. That is when the country deserves it.
Yeah, there was, my country, right or wrong mentality. That's nationalism. It doesn't matter what the moral, the moral character or the policies. It's my tribe. It's my nation. It's collectivist. Whereas patriotism, as I understand it, is supporting freedom. It's supporting a free country because it's free and individualistic, and that's a great virtue.
Good. Well, thank you, Andy.
Oh yeah, this is
done out 2 hours.
Yeah. Well, it just flew by, didn't it?
It did. It goes by.
Can I plug my website and Patreon account?
Sure, absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you. Anybody wants to support the work I'm doing, AndrewBernstein.net. You can link to my Patreon account. And I should have had a copy of the Hero book here. Could have held it up. Heroes, Legends, Champions, Why Heroism Matters. So, I thank you for your support, and thanks, Yaron, for having me on. This was fun.
Sure, pleasure. This was fun. Good. Thanks, Andy.
All right, take care, Yaron. Have a good day.
Don't forget to like the show. We had a lot of viewers. There should be a lot more likes on there. So before you leave, please press the like button. So I know many of you enjoyed that. More than 68 likes. That's pathetic. There you go. Keep liking. Keep going. And don't forget to share the show. And of course, if you like the work that I do, if you like these shows, thank you, Michael. That's a very generous contribution. If you like the show, if you like the work, then please support the show. You can do it in yaronbrookshow.com/support or Patreon or Subscribestar or on Locals. And thanks, everybody. I'll see you all.
Let me just hold up a copy of Heroes, Legends, Champions. Here's the book. If you read it and liked it, a 5-star review on Amazon is appreciated. Thanks, guys.
Good. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Yaron.
Bye, everybody. Have a